So hello everybody, and thanks for coming in this hour, which is pretty much different for everybody. My name is Peter Jandrich. I'm chairing today's session, and I'll just say a few words before we move on to the actual session. I've UNESCO-DCMÉT chair is I joined this event first a few years ago, and it was really an amazing experience. We had a lovely discussion, and since then I've been participating in those conferences every year. And this year, when I got an invitation to participate in and to organize a dialogue, yet another dialogue at yet another conference, I was thinking that it would be a really nice opportunity to talk about things like people mentioned in the chat, like post-digital presence, post-digital absence, and so on, but also things like human data interaction and everything that really comes community-wise with those things. And right at when my invitation to participate in this has arrived, we were just I'm a serious editor of a post-digital science and education book series, and just about at that time Sarah Hayes, Michael Jopling, Stuart Connor, and Matthew Johnson have submitted their book for production and actually for publication. And I really thought that the content of this book is something that would be a very good starting point for this year's discussion at DCMÉT chair. So I invited Sarah and Michael to come over and to organize a session roughly around their book and their ideas in the book. And this is where I'll stop, because I don't really know what they planned for the session. So I will just ask Sarah and Michael to tell us what we're going to do next.
Thanks for trusting us, Peter. And lovely to have everybody here. Yes, I'm Sarah Hayes at Bath University and talking from Worcester just now. Michael and I hope that we could kick this off just by sharing a few thoughts that might hopefully provoke the dialogue. So I will just say a little bit more background to what Peter was just saying about the book. So between 2020 and 2022, we were awarded some engineering and physical science research council funding and ran 2 funded projects, which opened up this cross-sector interdisciplinary dialogue about data disadvantage and digital inclusion. And that's the little bit of background really to us then working with an awful lot of wonderful authors to bring together the research that sort of led to this book called Human Data Interaction, Disadvantage and Skills in the Community. So there is a copy for people to find in the chat and have a look at. And I will just say that human data interaction is drawn from human computer interactions. So started as quite a systems sort of framework, but it's about how this concerns all of us in terms of a blurred situation that we now find with the nature of data. So we can ask ourselves a few questions like, how much agency do we have concerning data? How legible are our interactions with data? How negotiable are our interactions with data? And should or can we, as individuals, resist some data interactions? So those are a few thoughts that come from the human data interaction framework. And by bringing this cross-sector debate to the dialogue, we were hoping to also focus on the human social justice side of digital systems debates. And the book has such a cross-sector authorship. We've had councils and business and international academics contributing to it. So it explores all sorts of issues from different parts of the world, different contexts, different local and global contexts, and about this changing nature of data. Things like how people who are digitally disadvantaged or vulnerable can, how do they react to things like cookies or QR codes, or the fact that we seem to be moving into a cashless society, and all of the different data-driven systems that are around us online and offline. So I'm going to pass back to Michael just to share a few further thoughts on this, particularly about this blurring of data in post-digital contexts.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. I'm Michael Jopling from the University of Brighton in the UK. And we don't want to say too much, because one thing that the book, as Sarah said, was focused on dialogue. So dialogue between academic writers, but also people working with various forms of technology, but also people working particularly with young people about how to overcome the disadvantage associated with the kind of divides we're talking. So we're not just talking about the traditional digital divide, but also kind of data divides. So that in that people who have less access to all kinds of resources in societies are kind of doubly disadvantaged by not having necessary access to data. So that the ubiquity of data, that data is everywhere, is one of the issues. But also, as Sarah said, the kind of blurring between where do we stop, where do we start as human beings, as individuals, and where does the data come in? So I think one of probably the most interesting aspect of the book for us, but also the most challenging, was bringing those different voices and bringing that dialogue together. Because obviously, when it started off as workshops, people talking online, because it was during when we had lockdowns, when we first got used to having discussions like this, and so then kind of bringing that together, coalescing that into a book. But then one of the reasons for being keen to do this session is that we didn't want the book and the dialogue to stop there. It's because, there's an artifact, there's a PDF, there's a book we can wave, but these dialogues are at least as important now as they were when we first started doing this work a few years ago. So back to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. And love this idea of the book not being the end, but perhaps the start, and, ongoing work, because one of the things that Michael and I just were talking about before this session was the way that AI, artificial intelligence, has exploded into, the news, the media everywhere this year. And, many people here will have ideas about that, and it's part of this dialogue, of course. What we wanted to raise really was some thoughts about, when we've had so much hype about artificial intelligence and the driving of social change that's been possibly drowning out some of the debate that we had raised in the book. And we wanted to put that to you to have a little bit of a think about that, and to share thoughts around, where we are with artificial intelligence. And I liked a quote from Gary Hall, who said that computer science as a discipline is not necessarily best equipped to understand itself, its own founding object, and let alone help those in the humanities with their relationships with computing and the digital. And with that sort of thought in mind, it's made me wonder, really, when I'm looking at the news in the last few days, how we're actually bringing together some of the things like the political figures and what they're saying, what the technical experts are coming out with, and where are the social justice concerns coming in there for the vulnerable, the digitally disadvantaged? Is there any of that coming out onto the table of those discussions? So, for example, we've had the BBC shouting about cyber attacks and biological and chemical attacks brought on by AI. And this alarmist sort of aspect just seems to be, to us, drowning out the post-digital inclusion arguments and the more contextual human data interaction concerns about agency and legibility and negotiability for all of us. So that's really just another question to put to you. Is this AI dialogue sufficiently disruptive, really, to resist all the hype and genuinely highlight what's actually needed in terms of support for individuals? And I'll, for the last time now, pass back to Michael to open our shared dialogue.
Yes, so we were kind of thinking, how do we try and encourage this dialogue to keep going? What kind of question do we give? So I thought, well, as the title of this session was, one of these, when you kind of think, what title are we going to give it? And that was my idea, to steal Nick Lowe's song from 1974, nearly 50 years ago, which is scary. But what's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? There is in that song a question. Well, there are several questions, in fact. But I'll put the question in the chat shortly. There's a question which is, where are the strong and who are the trusted? So we thought that might be a suitably open question to get people to suggest what they're thinking about this, or you may be stunned into silence and think, what on earth are you talking about? But hopefully the former rather than the latter. So over to everybody else.
Ooh. You can't do that. You can't say everybody else.
John, you go for it, because we don't know how long you'll last. You look really uncomfortable. I'm sorry to see that.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I didn't mean to bounce myself into this position. I'm John Traxler, and I'm UNESCO chair in informal and God, sorry, I'm fading already. Innovative and informal digital learning in disadvantaged and development contexts. And I suppose actually, whilst I might have a whole range of reactions and understandings and misunderstandings around what's been said and the history of it all, I suppose it makes most sense for me to come at it from, if you like, that kind of specialist perspective of the global south and disadvantage. And I suppose, thanks to Peter, I'm doing a chapter in a forthcoming book with some folk at Edinburgh, in which I'm representing the global south, if you like, in relation to the post-digital, and realizing in writing that chapter, in a sense, how far back I need to go, we need to go, how many assumptions and perhaps prejudices we need to remove before we can ask ourselves what's the nature of the post-digital in societies that are not like ours. And I've characterized ours as Western European and white settler nations. And that seems to be kind of culturally homogenous. I mean, certainly culturally homogenous compared to what's on the other side of that divide. And so there's all sorts of assumptions, not only kind of, if you like, hardware assumptions about, I don't know, connectivity, infrastructure, roads, buildings, electricity, but assumptions about the nature of learning and education, and assumptions about language and how we use it. And in this context about data, you know, and presumably data is somewhere in there with knowledge, and suddenly I'm asking about other people's knowledge systems, which I suppose implicitly is asking about other people's data systems. So on the one hand, you've got what does data, the word, mean in other knowledge contexts? What's its significance? And how's it used, and to what extent do people value it or not value it? I mean, how do they generate it in those other societies? How do they share it and merge it and valorize it and discard it? Sorry, losing my thread slightly. Yeah, so there's all of those questions, in a sense, saying that whatever discussion we have coming from this particularly white settler European perspective, there's we have to question all of them, the vast majority. But also I'm seeing this, or being made to see this, from a decolonial or decolonialistic perspective, and asking in the global knowledge systems which other societies access and are overpowered by, quite possibly, to what extent do those global knowledge systems represent a kind of digital recolonization, and at a superficial level, are we shoving in front of them all sorts of images and icons and interactions that represent our values, you know, egg timers, filing cabinets, clocks, you know, you name it. Well, you don't have to name it, you just have to look at your computer screen. So to what extent, you know, are we putting all of those in front of them? And actually then behind them, to what extent are all of the other IT systems that, I don't know, provide data, a representation of colonialistic attitudes? and so, the classic examples are the bias built into search engines, into the search engines which provide data. And I often quote the fact that I think, Wikipedia has more information, or more data, if you like, on Middle Earth than it does on the Central African Republic, and has that knowledge in English rather than Kikuyu. I think the balance between, for example, Arabic on Wikipedia and English on Wikipedia is 10 to 1, in favor of English. So, it's not, in a sense, only an issue about what data are you getting, but what data are you not getting. So if you're Arabic, you're getting a tenth of what I'm getting. And if you're interested in Rwanda, you're not getting as much as anyone interested in Rivendell. Yeah, so there's certainly those two aspects coming at me around a conversation of data in the post-digital context. How's about that? Have I said enough?
I'm already looking forward to reading the chapter, John, and certainly on all of
So
that.
am
I
I.
love the way you expanded it all out, but you made me think of one chapter that's in the Human Data Interaction book, which asks the question, who gets to create data? And it's written by Uche Ogwude, and Uche's from Nigeria. And I just thought that his perspective on it really opened out some of the things that you have been saying, because different parts of the world where, the creation of data, is, or we're not getting that data, are we? Or, we're flooding data from.
So I ought to have said actually that my perspective in talking about the North-South, I mean, on the basis of it being English and it being the conversation we usually have, and in my experience in Africa, is literally North-South and misses out the East. And I'm sorry, I'm conscious that some of this conference is hosted in Korea. And actually, sorry, someone did a presentation recently, someone from the University of South Wales, on decolonization, and mentioned their gratitude to the work I'd done. And someone in the audience said, yes, but John Traxler's just some old white guy. And so I ought to own up to being some old white guy, and I can't honestly speak on behalf of, well, even any other old white guys, let alone people in other parts of the world or in other demographics or social classes. I have stopped now. The drugs are wearing off.
I can tell Christine's about to say something. I'm sure
I was going
she
to
is.
say something that's gone out my head. But it's the word negotiable seems it's coming out to me quite a lot in what people are saying, and who's allowed to talk. So it's and who's allowed into the negotiations, because so many of the data gathering systems we encounter are based on an assumption that you will provide data within already established parameters, and I think, I mean, John's really got me thinking of this digital colonization. I don't know how we get out of this. Well, and perhaps we need to be thinking about things like advocacy. If you are speaking for other people, are you really how are you representing them, and how are you? Why aren't they doing it themselves, and why aren't we making it possible? And sometimes it's because of language, but sometimes.
Well, I've had part of that problem. I've been working with a woman, Taskeen Adam from South Africa, who's done far more, and with the EdTech Hub in the UK, done far more on decolonizing EdTech than I have. And we worked together back in several years ago, and I did actually make the point quite early on. I am an old white guy, and feel really uncomfortable with this. And shouldn't you be doing it, Taskeen? And she says, no, not exactly. You have a position and a visibility. It's your job as much as anyone else's. So that's part of the answer to your question.
Yes. So I mean, I think Michael's question of where are the strong and who are the trusted is important, and the answers to those may not be the same in both cases, but we have to, yeah, we can't just say, you know, well, in my case, I'm an old white woman, but I can't just say, so I can't speak. We have to speak for other people and advocate for them sometimes.
I really like how you've put that, Christine. And Caroline's waving her hand at us. So lovely to sit. Well, we can't see you, Caroline. Oh, we can.
Now,
Great.
now. How are you doing? Thank you for putting this together. Yeah, I'm Caroline. Caroline Kuhn, and I work at the University of Paspa, where I have Sarah, thanks God now. And yeah, so I just want to say I'm also very interested in working with people in, let's say, resource constrained environments. But I think I have a slightly different position, because I think that the trusted and the strong, or however that question is phrased, I think that we're stronger together. That's what I think. And I think that the point here really is that we're not having the conversation somewhere else, but that we have the conversation with the people we're interested in working with. And that's what we do everywhere we do work. You know, if we have I don't know, an Erasmus project, we put those 7 universities in the table, and we travel and we go and we do to meet and then to think together, and then, you know, to come up with ideas. And I think that's the same thing when you're working with people in resource constrained environments. It takes longer, I think, because the resources are not there, because many different things, because you have to translate, because you have to find the people to, you know, whatever that is. But definitely, I don't think we need to have 2 teams, the trusted and the other. I think we have to have, you know, the will, because the intention is there, but the will and find the strategy, I think, to have everyone on the table and have a conversation with also as equals. Because yes, we, in this case, I can't see everyone because I don't see all the cameras, but at least the ones that have talked, we're white. But, you know, I sometimes think that there is not such division when you talk with people in kind of rural communities in Venezuela, where I come from, where we have a big Black population as well, because it has been, you know, from, well, whatever, but we have that. And I grew up with them. They were my friends. And I think the division really, there is a way that division is blurred. And I think we need to find that. And so that we are as equals in the table, finding and brainstorming solution, as we would do, as like, you know, in any other project. That's kind of how I see it. How to do that, I'm figuring that out, but I'm sure maybe slower, maybe in different ways. But I think for me, that has been something that I believe it works, because they are super empowered people, super empowered, super. The women are incredibly empowered. Now, the patriarchal system is a problem, but it doesn't mean they are not empowered. For example, so, you know, how do we think together about that? So yeah, that I was just wanting to say that. Thank you, Sarah.
No, thank you, Caroline. And Carl's coming in now with some comments.
Yeah, I just, the idea of resource constrained sort of triggered me a little bit, if that's a word, triggered. So yeah, so basically last night someone came round to our house who was you know, in the UK, which is not a resource constrained environment, but the resources were particularly constrained because they couldn't get Wi-Fi anywhere or afford to have a Wi-Fi connection. So they came around to use my Wi-Fi so they could take part in a Green Women's Charter debate thing. So it's just the visibility and invisibility of people in well-resourced environments. So the constraints, you know, they're different, obviously, but
that's why the word is excellent, because it applies to everyone. It's not the global south or, you know, whatever. It's where the resources are constrained, and that's exactly what it means for me, at least. You know, resource constraint can be your neighbor, can be someone in Wales, can be someone in even in London, even in London, you know, that people wouldn't believe, but there are people that are incredibly resource constrained. And so I think for me that works, because it applies to all those who are constrained in a particular resource that is vital for a particular thing. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I sometimes worry about too much emphasis on the resource constraints issue, because well, what I've certainly said quite a few times in Africa is actually, once we get rid of the resource constraints, I mean, they're an easy, as it were, easy problem to formulate, you know, and you could argue just throw money at them. But then, you know, once you get rid of the resource constraints, then it gets interesting. Then you start to see the, I don't know, the cultural differences or linguistic differences or the other aspects of the power differences.
But constraints is not money, John. Constraint is a very broad term, and you have to
okay.
define that.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
If you have a language barrier, then that is the constraint to have
Yeah.
a communication. If that makes sense.
Yes, it's just that when we, it's a common problem that when our words leak out from academia, they get taken and twisted. I think that's possibly one of the ones that gets twisted. You know, the idea that you can, you know, the reason that people are well, sorry, that it is just a money problem. That resources equals money. We throw money at it, it'll get better.
No. Yeah, I agree. No, not the case. Not the case.
I throw one other thought in that just occurred to me, was about the elements of choice. So if you do remove those sorts of constraints and resource constraints, what about when people want to decide, you know, to live in certain ways, and the digital takeover means that, you know, they are squeezed out of it even when they have those resources and they want to take those choices. And also when Carl was saying about you know, the situations of not being able to get online in different places that are well resourced, we discovered during the pandemic that 1/5 of the West Midlands in the UK was simply not on the internet, which at the time was quite a startling figure that came out in some of the dialogues that we were having with groups that were trying to help with digital inclusion in the West Midlands. So it raises these other things about when, you know, who's making certain decisions for us as well, on all the different things that, are we still going to use cash? Are we going to all do things with QR codes? I know, you know, there's many other examples.
Yeah, we sort of went through all the places you could get online, you know, in Shrewsbury, in the West Midlands, and after a certain time, there's no way you can get online if you don't have your own Wi-Fi. If you can't afford it, so you can use your 4G, but even then, you've got to pay for 4G. But libraries closed, pubs are, you know, not suitable. Blah blah blah.
And Tim's waving as well. Thanks, Carl. I think he's got going to come in.
Thanks, Sarah. I just want to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land from which I speak, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It's sort of a double-edged sword, I think, that if you're inside the data, then you're oppressed and datafied in various ways. And if you're outside the data, then you're marginalized in other ways. And being inside the data is, I think it's always a kind of regression to the mean. I need to think about that more to see if I actually agree with that. But in general, you end up sort of regressing towards the mean through these datafied processes. And it kind of marginalizes the fringe elements and pulls you back to a sort of normative, I don't know, like, and probably quite bland middle ground often. But we can do some things in terms of datafication. We can tweak some aspects of who shows up in the data and how, and who creates and who has agency and control and authority. It's not easy to do that. We can do a little bit. But what I wanted to do is ask a couple of questions rather than try and pose solutions. And they're to do with hope and where we can find hope. So the first one is thinking about the book as an object of hope. So this panel is kind of about a book, and it's kind of not, but a book is both a digital and an analog object or artifact, and it's it consists of data, but also of rich experience, and it's static, but it's also dialogic, especially this kind of book. So what might we learn from the book as a kind of object of hope in this sphere? And the other one is, in Michael's title, What's Funny, I was thinking about humor and where we can find hope in humor, because humor is like one of, I'm not sure who's, I'm getting a lot of feedback. Yeah, so feedback, sorry, not feedback. Humor is one of the most difficult things to crush, I think. You know, you can be in an absolutely disastrous situation and someone will still often find humor. And does humor show up in data? And if not, will it still find a way, even in a really datafied landscape? And what form will it take? And what kind of lessons can we take from the resistance that you find in humor? So does the fact that humor is so difficult to crush and datify suggest that there's always some agency and there's always some hope? It just might not be mainstream. So I kind of wanted to use the book and humor as these provocations to think about, where can we find hope? Where can we find agency in this otherwise quite sterile, datafied landscape?
Thanks, Tim. I'm sure you will have provoked others to come in at this point. I'm just sending
Christine
in.
would like this one.
Yes, yeah, I like that one. I'm a great fan of parody as a way of deflecting some of the authoritarian approaches to things. And when you were talking about the book, it was interesting. You're talking about the book is both analog and digital, and the analog, the old print version, is something that's closed. It's finished, it's completed, except that it maybe provokes dialogues. Those digital dialogues and the digital versions of books become a little more opened because of the ability to change all the time, even to have changes sort of just sent electronically to your existing copy of the book, which is a completely different sort of kind of artifact. But parody has always been the way that the people that are dispossessed or disadvantaged can attack the sort of authoritarian regimes, parody and humor and satire. I think that will be hard for datafication to quash. I think that's in us, and it'll never go away. I don't know whether that's what you were talking about there.
I don't know if there's an indirect connection, but it's making me think of comments about people like Donald Trump and Boris Johnson almost depriving humor or parody of its sting, because they can, you know, real life can outdo parody these days.
Yes, that is a threat to parody. It's a shame. But
although you think we didn't have long to kind of think of how to deal with that in a parody frame, right? Like, I think eventually we would have worked out a way to create parody out of that situation. That's what I think.
No, it's not
and
finished.
I think probably parody or humor in general is very, very culturally specific. And I don't know if parody has implications in terms of self-esteem, or the balance between the individual and the community, or risk-taking and risk avoidance. Sorry, I'm quoting the Dutchman, sorry, cultural dimensions bloke, you know, in thinking that if culture is somehow an artifact of some of those dimensions of culture, then actually they might not think it's funny, even though we do.
it can be used against you as well as for you, of course. That's its nature. But it's dialogical, and I think that's what's important, because a lot of the things we're talking about are closed and people have no way in to negotiate. They're non-negotiable. But if you can bring forms of dialogue, and humor might be a way in, I think, even though it's different in different cultures.
Yeah, that's making me think that the reason humor wouldn't show up in data is because it's found in between things. It's found in the relations between things, you know, the relations between people, not in objects and not in measurable elements.
Yeah, and I worry in the increasing use of computers and technology in language learning, that they kind of reduce, and actually there is a technology exactly the same as the Babel fish, if anyone's Douglas Adams aware, you know, and they reduce language to syntax and grammar and vocabulary, and actually kind of entirely miss the point about nuance or body language. I mean, the same happens in research. You know, when people transcribe an interview, what you're left with is the syntax and the grammar, and you've taken out all the gaps and the ums and the ahs. You know, so in turning language into data, you've probably deprived it of 90% of its meaning. And in the case of learning language as merely grammar and syntax, the same thing happens.
Yeah.
I agree with all of that except the 90%, just because it's a number, and I think that
I've just datafied it.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, weather forecasters have a vocabulary which consists of, what is it? Possibly, probably, less likely. So I'll opt for probably instead of saying 90%.
I don't know if I can just pop in. Well, I'm Ana from Porto, and I was listening to you, and a few ideas. First, I recalled a Portuguese humorist that is called Ricardo Araújo Pereira, and he's recently, well, with some lawsuit on his head because of a joke that he made with the Prime Minister and the Portuguese government. So this is also the other part. He's not very worried about it, but the fact is that he's being sued because of that. So, and then this also raises some questions concerning the freedom of speech that is from, well, a few situations that have been happening worldwide, also starting to be at stake. And another issue that came to my mind was all this paradox also about the digital and the huge amount of possibilities that it brings to us. For example, it wouldn't be possible for us to be talking here today if this didn't exist and hadn't reached the development that it has. And then the other side of the coin, and also all the frightening and crazy and completely horrible possibilities that it also raises. And on the other hand, all those that do not have access to it, as you have referred. So sometimes I make this joke with my students. So I teach mainly computer science engineering first year students, that the clouds should explode. To understand what I mean with that, the clouds, like everything, we have everything online, so everything is on the cloud, and we sometimes forget the ground and the relationship, direct relationship with people and what they actually feel. So when I say this in class, sometimes they just stay like, oh my God, and what would be of our jobs or our jobs to be. So I probably am not making much sense, but I'm just sharing some thoughts that came to my mind while you were speaking, and actually, what can we that are the blessed or favored ones that have access to the information and that are able to distinguish what can actually help or be positive and productive for people, what can we do to improve or help others that are living in situations that are undescribable and that do not have access to, well, most of the times, and we are seeing it these days, and we have always seen it. So what actually how can we actually help, or all this discussion then bring something to the outside and make a difference? It was a little bit.
Thank you, Anna. It made lots of sense to me, Anna, and this is what the dialogue is about, isn't it? I'm sure there will be others that want to pick that up. I think Tim does.
Thanks. And I just had a thought, which you can tell me whether this is relevant or not relevant, but I've been thinking ever since someone was talking about cashless societies, about the kind of contrast between seamless approaches to things and seamful approaches to things, and how things are tending towards trying to become more seamless. You know, things just work, systems knit together, and we have this kind of frictionless experience of life. And then there's a kind of a seamful movement where, for example, the free phone is a phone that you create, and you can take the bits and replace them with other bits, and you know how it works because you have to kind of make it, or anything where you have to kind of know how the workings work and fit them together, and there you end up having quite a lot of agency because you've got an understanding of how these things, they might not be as slick as an iPhone, but you get it, and you can do things with it, and you can be creative with it, and you can really engage with it in a different way. And it strikes me that we might be able to promote seamfulness a bit more than we do. We often take for granted that seamless is better, that we all want seamless, and actually I'm not convinced it is better. I think they have different functions, and there are times for seamlessness, but there are a lot of times for seamfulness, and we probably need to think more about that. Sorry, I'll stop, Peter.
If you're not careful, Tim, Petra will have you writing a chapter on that.
Nah, no worries, not yet, not right now at the moment. There's some other things, but I would like to chip into the discussion and say that for me, the question of the strong and the trusted is really important, because the strong are obviously different from the trusted, or maybe they're not, or there's a very interesting dynamic here. But then when we speak about this, I mean, a lot of comments here have been about speaking about the book, the digital and the physical book, and speaking about humor, and now speaking about all these other things. There's a lot of I think that we are kind of moving in circles around the question of if we have human data interaction, so which part is kind of uniquely human and which part is more, not really uniquely, but more like machinistic, or more associated with the computer. So the idea that there is the data doesn't see humor because humor is in between, and then a completely different idea that speaking as an old white guy in decolonial settings can be quite uncomfortable. Makes me question, okay, so how do we connect those two things? So we have something that's in between. We have the position which is like so something like humor, something that's human, which is decidedly in between. But then when we speak about people, then we say, okay, so John is white and a white old guy, and we kind of define John. So there's nothing in between there. So he said, I'm this, and I feel uncomfortable about this, and because it's who I am. I mean, of course, it is who you are, but I mean, we can also be some other things as well, and we can be other things at the same time. And this is exactly, if we take a look at this position in between data, which is, by the way, not just occupied by humor. There are other things that can be found in between data, like love, emotion, human attraction, and so on and so on and so on. But then we kind of still take this data logic, take this logic of the computer to define, to put human beings into certain brackets, such as old white guy or whatever, young, disadvantaged, or whatever the bracket is. And now, I think for me, I mean, I really enjoyed this discussion because it's so awkward, because people are not sure what we are really talking about, and then everybody's trying to kind of chip in and trying to contribute, but it all goes all around, and what I'm saying now is as well very nebulous, and I'm not really making any particular point here.
Yes.
But for me, that's the essence of this type of meeting, right? Because if we communicate in some other ways, like if I write an article, then I'm sending something that's straightforward. If I'm answering a straightforward question, then I'm going to give a straightforward answer. But if we leave things open, then we are open to those things in between. And those things in between are not really those that, I mean, can we put a name on them? Probably no. But should we talk about them? I think that we should.
Sorry, what you're reminding me of in writing this chapter, in hoping to write this chapter, I was forced to think about what, courtesy of your remarks on the post-digital, forced to think about the balance or the relationship between the human and the digital, and partly to think about how, if you like, the global south or the disadvantage unbalances our existing preconceptions about the human and the digital. You know, where's the dividing line? And how mobility and connectivity do something similar. You know, we have multiple identities thanks to cyberspace, and we have different involvements in different communities, and the kind of boundary between us as individuals and other people and societies changes as we become involved in different spaces, in different cyberspaces, social spaces, professional spaces, and so on. But then how, looking at the natural world, something similar is happening, that different cultures and different societies have a different idea about the balance between us as humans, if you like, and the natural world, and that and perhaps have a much more holistic view about us and the natural world, and our place in it, as opposed to our place oppressing it. And I guess that's got some implications for data, if you like, because the nature of knowledge when one is part of the natural world is different from the nature of knowledge when one just does things to the natural world. So it's really quite helpful to look at the post-digital in other cultural contexts, because it helps to unsettle that if you like, ecosystem between the natural, quote unquote, the human, quote unquote, and the digital, quote unquote. And I suppose I was also forced to unpack the digital, because I mean, we kind of refer to it quite glibly, but if we look at other societies, you know, we find, for example, very, very, very few computers and lots and lots and lots of mobiles, you know, and that must be doing something to what's going on. You know, their digital is not our digital. So those were some of the reflections in this half-finished piece of writing. Oops.
I just wanted to note, John, that when I was writing my first article for PETA for the first issue of Post-Digital Science and Education, I kind of did a bit of a search on digital education and thought about what digital is. And the earliest thing I found was that digital education from a dentistry context in, I can't remember, before 1900, I think. And what they were talking about was learning to use the fingers on both hands in order to better manipulate objects around them. So digital education was literally educating the digits, and it kind of got me thinking about etymology and where did this kind of word digital come from and that sort of thing.
Yeah, sorry, and you've illustrated a point which I think we underplay in research, which is the not worth mentioning and the taken for granted, and how it's very easy for us to have conversations, either like in this context, if you like, amongst ourselves as a peer group, or with research participants. And if there is no cultural distance between us, we're on safe ground in kind of understanding what's going on. But as soon as we move away from anything that isn't, I don't know, old white guys, you know, middle class, university educated, there are just more and more opportunities for misunderstanding. Yeah, and that comes up, you know, when we're attempting to understand other people's culture and language and discourses.
Which is why you have to hear both sides of the story, which is why dialogue's always needed.
Mm.
Because you can be talking for a long time without realizing that the people on the other side are hearing something different. I discovered that as a teacher sometimes, if I made assumptions about people's cultural awareness, and you had to backtrack afterwards. It's very easy to start citing television programs from the UK that people all around the world have never heard of, just on a trivial example. Yeah,
I think that we are slowly running out of time. We should finish at, well, what is in 1 minute approximately. Of course, we can take a few more minutes to wrap up. So perhaps Sarah or Michael would like to say how this discussion, I mean, is this what you imagined and what we got from this discussion?
Go for it, Michael.
Well, I think I quite like your idea, Peter, about having a completely open dialogue without expectations. One thing that struck me, I think, just when John and Christine were just talking, is that, to take it back to the book, which was a starting point, it was one of the things that came out of it is the academic people writing were much harder to get to adapt their kind of writing style than the non-academic people. So I think we thought it would be hard, I think, working with people who don't write very often. In fact, they were very open, whereas some of the academics, not all of them, because I know some of them are involved here, were kind of like, this is what we write. And it's interesting, so that those barriers are there, and the barriers are kind of our barriers often, rather than people who don't engage in the kind of writing that ends up in books. So I think the more kind of dialogues we can have like this and you know, involve people where there aren't any rules, and you say, right, these are the kind of chains of association. And I think also Tim's notion of hope is really important. Hope, we should cling on to hope, and hope in books and humor is good. Hope in young people as well is the other thing, I think, because they, as John said, the young people's use of the digital is very different to old white people like some of us. I don't know, what do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. All of that, and to keep the parody, as Christine was saying, definitely. One other thought was just the different types of writing that the post-digital network community has been involved in. So much of it that Petter and Michael Peters and others have brought together to do with collective understandings and trialing different ways to almost subvert the different publishing styles, I think is hugely helpful as well, to know that people can engage in small ways and bigger ways and, you know, collectively write things that, you know, just maybe sort of changes some of those, I don't know, very much, as you mentioned, the academic set in our ways types of, I think that's very much open to us bringing in people from different sectors. And even though it's quite challenging for editing, I'd like us to continue, you know, and to try to do lots more of that, because as you say, it does add different dimensions and, you know, stops us just making assumptions. And I think, like Christine said, you know, we can easily assume a lot if we don't listen to the other side.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'll just say something for a minute or two and then say goodbye. I think that, I mean, I have a short admission to make. I mean, this panel is a bit of an experiment. I've been thinking a lot, working in publishing business. I've been thinking a lot about the genre and the idea how the genre helps us to do something or restricts us in some certain ways. So, for instance, if we have a scholarly article which is like 7, 8, or 9,000 words, and you need to structure your argument in a certain way, you need to have an introduction, a methodology, whatever, conclusion, keywords, and whatnot. It really doesn't just shape the way we present our thoughts. It really shapes our thoughts, just the very thoughts on a very fundamental level. That's why, for instance, post-digital science and education has quite a few genres like book reviews and interviews and so on, because I would like to experiment with the genre and see which different opportunities and possibilities lie within the genre. Now, the experiment here really is the question, because we don't have just genres are not just written, right? So we can also have different types of dialogues and different types of conversations. And I think, so there are dialogues which are like structured, semi-structured, or non-structured whatsoever. And I think that we as academics always tend to go towards more structure, towards either fully structured or semi-structured stuff, because we feel more confident, because we feel that it's kind of, it will make us look better, that we will be able to say something probably more interesting or whatever, that if we prepare, that we will actually be able to appear to ourselves and to others as somebody knowledgeable and so on. But basically there's, I think that there is a lot of power and a different type of power in a completely unstructured dialogue, when actually people open up and say, okay, so let's just allow a free flow of thoughts. And this reminds me of Michael's chapter in a post-digital research book, which was recently published, where Michael speaks about post-digital vulnerability. And yes, this type of conversation leaves us quite vulnerable, because we don't really know what we're talking about, so we never know whether we are talking nonsense or whether we are talking something important for somebody. But then whoever listens and whoever joins interpret things in their own ways, as we said. And I think that this position of somehow, when Michael asked at the beginning, who are the strong? Well, I think that a bit paradoxically, this power is not, power can come from things like, you know, I have a lot of money, or I control infrastructure, so I've got the power and so on. But also power, especially power, creative power, I think is very much connected to this vulnerability and to this feeling of, I don't really know what I'm doing. because I think that this type of really soft power is something that allows us to think and to communicate in ways which are very, very different from those we are normally used to. And I think it's really important to allow such opportunities, to allow ourselves to spend an hour like this talking about things that we don't really exactly know what we are talking about, but nevertheless going out of the conversation hopefully a bit richer and a bit and with some new ideas and with some fresh thoughts that we wouldn't have otherwise. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for participating.